Hello, everyone, and welcome to Talk Nerdy. Today is Monday, March 30th, 2026, and I'm the host of the show, Dr. Cara Santamaria. And like I do every week, I want to start the show by thanking those of you who make Talk Nerdy possible. If you're interested in pledging your support as little as $1 on an episodic basis, all you've got to do is visit patreon.com, that's patreon.com/talknerdy to learn more. This week's top patrons include Chuck Blell, David J.E. Smith, Daniel Lang, Mary Neva, Will Dufresne, David Compton, Brian Holden, Gabo J., Ulrika Hageman, Pasquale Gelati, and Joe Wilkinson. And of course, so many more. Thank you all from the bottom of my heart. You keep this going. You help me pay the editor. You help me pay my my coordinator. And yeah. Keep the show going, even though I am working many hours at this point in my clinic. I'm going to keep making the show as long as you guys want to keep listening to it. And this week I have a really interesting episode for you. So I had the opportunity to speak with Dr. Marlene Zuk. She is Regents Professor of Ecology, Evolution, and Behavior at the University of Minnesota, and she's a member of the National Academy of Sciences. She's written for a ton of different outlets that I know you've read, like the New York Times, the LA Times, and New Scientist, and she's written several books previously, including Dancing Cockatoos and the Dead Man Test, and also Paleo Fantasy. But she has a new book out, and it was actually named a Spotify editor's pick for the month of March. It's called Outsider Animals: How the Creatures at the Margins of Our Lives Have the Most to Teach Us. So without any further ado, here she is, Dr. Marlene Zuk. Well, Marlene, thank you so much for joining me today.
My pleasure.
I'm excited to talk about your new book, Outsider Animals: How the Creatures at the Margins of Our Lives Have the Most to Teach Us. And of course, we'll probably touch on some of your other writing over the course of the conversation. But before we get into this specific book and all the hard work that went into it and kind of how it came to be, I would love to go back a little bit and talk about your career. So you are a Regents Professor of Ecology, Evolution, and Behavior at the University of Minnesota. That's a cool title, Ecology, Evolution, and Behavior. Is that the name of the department that you're in, or is it a multidisciplinary title?
It's the name of the department I'm in, and there's lots of EEB departments all over the country, and usually they just stand for ecology and evolutionary biology, or sometimes evolution and ecology, or something like that. And it's funny you mentioned that, because I moved to the University of Minnesota from the University of California 14 years ago. And I joke with people that part of the motivation for moving is that I got my own letter in the department, because it is ecology, evolution, and behavior. And I sometimes feel like animal behavior as a discipline gets shunted aside a little bit in ecology and evolutionary biology discussions and departments. And so I was really thrilled that we have a really strong behavior group, and it's a great place for someone with my interests. I mean, at the same time, I'm not really that precious about it. And I consider myself an evolutionary biologist who works in behavior, but it was just that special little fun thing that I said I get my own letter.
Well, yeah, and I do think that is an important distinction, because, my background is mostly psychology, my undergrad and my PhD, and one of my masters is in psychology, and I'm clinical. But my first master's was in biology, and I found that, like, for example, at my university, I didn't see much behavior at all in our bio department. It was all in the psych department. But when you're doing animal behavior in a psychology department, a lot of the background is wildly different. Like, being a behaviorist from a biological perspective is different than being a behaviorist from a psychological perspective.
Oh, I think that is such an interesting thing. We could spend the whole time talking just about that, because I'm really interested in how animal behavior as a discipline developed. its roots in absolutely, psychology. And I always tell people that modern behavioral ecology, which is the sort of flavor of animal behavior that I do, and which refers to the evolution of animal behavior.
Mm.
Modern behavioral ecology has three roots, and one of them is in comparative psychology from the United States in the early 20th century. All these people who were starting to think, oh, we could come up with generalizable rules about how animals, and really they were interested in humans. And I think that's the big
Hmm.
distinction, is that a lot of people coming at it from a psychology perspective, even if they're studying animals, they're often, not always, but often interested in understanding what animals do so that we can understand what people do better. And
Absolutely.
and there was a big emphasis on experimentation, and that was, like Skinner and how we can manipulate the environment, and a big emphasis on learning. And we have to use rats and pigeons for everything. But then there's another root of modern behavioral ecology that comes from the European ethology tradition, which is
Mm.
Konrad Lorenz and Karl von Frisch and Nico Tinbergen in Europe, looking at animals in their natural environment, wanting to understand how they were adapted to their individual habitats, wanting to understand what their behavior was like, and not doing it in the service of, we want to make kids learn to read faster or something like that.
Right, right.
And then those both got combined with the modern synthesis, the use of genetics to understand evolutionary biology better, which kicked in during the middle part of the 20th century. And all of those things helped us form what I now would call, and well, most other people would now call, behavioral ecology, which is understanding how behavior is an adaptation in its environment. And we do experiments, but we also observe animals in their natural habitats. We observe a wide range of animals. We don't just focus on a few model systems. And we also are interested in the animals to understand the animals, though there's also people who do behavioral ecology with people.
Hmm. I'm curious about your own training in this field. Did you find that the departments that you were in tended in one direction or another? Was there sort of a shaping of your perspectives through, through the universities that you attended, or did you have more of a smattering of these different perspectives?
I think I was lucky to get training during a time when behavioral ecology was kind of coming of age in, like, kind of the 80s,
Hmm.
when a lot of really, important thinkers, my PhD advisor was W.D. Hamilton, who's very well known for developing a lot of theory having to do with the evolution of altruism and cooperation, but who was also an outstanding natural history person and could go out in the field and really valued, again, seeing animals for what they were. And he was, just amazing at identifying plants and animals, but also doing theory. And so I was lucky enough to be exposed to that as a
Hmm.
graduate student. I mean, on the other hand, going back, further than that, I was definitely not one of those people who grew up knowing I wanted to be a professor of biology. I mean, I had no idea what I wanted to do. I've done a lot of different things, throughout my career. I think things always look more linear in retrospect than they did at the time.
Hmm. Yeah, yeah, no, I can definitely attest to that as like a third career PhD, like
Right, yeah, and
living
and
so
yet,
many
you feel like
lives.
it all contributes, right? It
Yeah,
all, like, kind of,
absolutely.
leads together to, what you wanna do. Yeah, I took a few years off. I didn't go to grad school right away, and a lot of people now will say, "Oh, you took a gap year," and it's like, calling it a gap year means that you knew that it was a
Mhm.
gap. I had no idea it was a gap. I was just doing what I was doing, so
Yeah, yeah. Oh, it's interesting too, thinking about, after graduate school, after even your postdoc, when you started to settle into academic life a little bit more, do you like now in your career, are you still doing predominantly do you run a lab still? Are you still doing a lot of publishing, or have you switched gears more into teaching and doing public science communication and kind of, I guess, broader picture perspective on the field?
I'm actually, it's good you asked me that because I'm actually just on the verge of retiring. So I
Mm,
just closed my lab, finished my last PhD students, which was of course bittersweet,
yeah.
and am now indeed moving into more public science communication, writing, and some other stuff. Partly because honestly, it's, and we could again spend the whole time on this. It's becoming a really grim time for people
Yeah.
doing basic science, well, actually, people doing any kind of science in the
Mm-hmm.
United States
Yeah.
right now. And also, I had, kind of had enough of a lot of the grant funding travails and things like that. So I am moving into a new area, and I'm really happy that I've always been interested in writing for the public because that's providing a nice transition to what I want to do now.
Yeah, absolutely. And so I'm curious when you look back at, both the full length books that you've written, like Dancing Cockatoos and The Dead Man Test, or uh, uh, oh, this is so fascinating. I love this. Okay. I love always reading what comes after the colon because I think it gets it gets forgotten sometimes, but it's actually the bulk of why things are so interesting. How behavior evolves and why it matters, but also paleo fantasy. On top of like the long form pieces that you've written and the other kind of more like reportage pieces that you've written for different outlets. Do you choose to dive into topics that you feel personally, I don't know, expert on and confident to be able to talk about from a research perspective? Or do you take the more journalistic tack and learn something, or maybe, a lot of things new when you sit down to write for the public?
Some of both. I've actually
Mm,
been interested for a while in the difference between sort of a classical journalist, science writer, qua science writer, which I
mhm,
don't consider myself, and someone who is a scientist who then also takes on writing for the public, which I obviously do consider myself.
mhm,
And I think there's some interesting distinctions there. I mean, there's plenty of people like you who straddle kind of the boundaries, but
mhm.
I do think there's a difference in perspective. I'm in a writing group with several other writers now, which has been fabulous for what I've been doing. They're amazing people and wonderful writers, and I'm the only scientist in the group.
Mm,
And it's been interesting because occasionally something will come up, and one of the people who's more of a journalist will say, oh, but aren't you going to report on that by whatever? And it's like I don't report.
right,
It's like,
right.
well, I mean, I
Yeah.
guess I do, but it just feels very foreign to me. And I feel like there's definitely some distinctions. And I think the tension between scientists themselves writing about science and science journalists coming in a little bit from the outside writing about
Mhm.
science has been interesting for a long, long time. There's a fabulous 1954 paper published in the journal Science by a wonderful biologist who I've learned a little bit about, named Florence Moog, who
Hmm.
took great offense at this previous publication in Science by a group of science journalists who basically dismissed scientists' abilities to communicate with the public. And,
Wow.
and she was like, hell no, we can do it fine. Thank you very much. And what's fascinating is realizing that this tension existed, like I said, in 1954. And
Mhm.
so I think we've been going back and forth about how science communication works, and that's easy to forget now that we have, podcasts and,
Yeah.
social media and all these ways that almost anyone can declare themselves to do science journalism, and we have SciComm as a thing,
Yeah,
and
now it's like a discipline and people can actually study it at university, which did not
exactly.
exist, 20 years ago.
Except that, of course, doing it existed
Yep.
70 years ago, right?
Yep, yep,
Like
yep.
I said, no, I will send you. I should send you the article because it's just wonderful. She's an amazing writer, and she talks a little bit about it. And so I'm very interested in science writing because I also obviously get a lot of questions from colleagues and students who are interested in going into it. And one of the things, actually, I'd be interested to know if you get this too, is that
Mm.
sometimes people are almost borderline, offensively dismissive about like, oh, well, you can just knock this stuff out.
Mhm.
Do you get
Mhm.
that from people where, people are like, oh, well, if I didn't have anything more important to do, I would do what you're doing?
Oh, 100%. Yeah.
Do you really? Oh, that's actually very reassuring to hear.
Yeah, absolutely. And what's funny is I see it kind of from both sides because just like you, there's sort of this how do I even put this? There's almost like a Venn diagram here. You've got your like scientists who have been doing a lot of lab work their whole lives who would never, touch a
Right.
public, communication with a 10-foot pole, and they only try to publish in the most esteemed peer-reviewed journals. And then
And
you've
they're
got
deeply suspicious of
absolutely.
science communicators trying to talk to them about their work because they have this like chip on their shoulder that, oh, you're gonna dumb it down, you're gonna make it, you're gonna twist my words, you're gonna blah blah blah. So
And
yeah,
yet
there's
they
those.
won't communicate it to the public because they're like, I can't self promote. Like that was something I used to see all the time. You're like, what? And then on the other side, you have, the trained science journalists who came up through J school who
Right,
do reporting, who are like, I do not advocate. That is not
right,
my role. Like I'm here to
right.
actually hold people to task. And then in the middle, you have this crossover where I've spent most of my career as a science communicator. I'm not a journalist. I was trained as a scientist. I do journalism sometimes, but actually I do see my job as to advocate for the scientific process, critical thinking, why science matters, and to highlight the contributions of a lot of scientists. And so there is some tension there sometimes with kind of like, what is your perspective going in and what do you see as the ultimate goal of your work? Are you trying to, like a journalist, take people to task and ensure that what is being done is brought out into the daylight? Or as a science communicator, are you there to help share amazing stories about science? And in some ways, I do think advocate for why science matters and tell those kinds of stories. Because sometimes those things they bump heads a little bit.
Yeah, and also I bet you probably go back and forth at least a little bit. But because one of the things with the science journalists, and I always laugh when I get interviewed sometimes by a journalist from one of the major outlets, is that you can tell they have to do that paragraph on the so and so who was not involved in the study.
Yeah, they have to. You're right. Yeah.
It says blah blah blah, and sometimes I'll get asked about it, and I think, why are you even asking me? And I realize that it's because, oh, I'm somehow on the Rolodex, the virtual Rolodex for this outlet, and they just have to find someone with something biology in their bio to do this, because I can't ask any of the people who would actually know about it.
Yeah, because there is a perspective, and whether it's we agree or not, there is a perspective that, okay, this amazing study that came out that everybody's talking about. Well, if I only talk to the people who did this study, there's an implicit bias there that it's great and it's going to change the world. And so I have to talk to people outside of that study to be like, are we overblowing this a little bit? Like,
Well,
is this as important as
are
we
we
think
overblowing
it
it
is?
a little bit? But sometimes I do get some funny questions. And sometimes it's actually good, and I think, oh, thank goodness you talked to somebody else, because I can actually tell you that the way you're perceiving this is really not great.
Yeah.
I'm not in terms of what the scientists thought, but just in terms of, because not everybody knows science who's doing science journalism. But anyway,
Absolutely.
yeah.
Yeah, and vice versa. Not everybody who is a scientist knows, journalistic ethics. And so, yes, to speak to, sorry, I forgot the question until right now. I see that you get it from both sides. Scientists saying, well, anybody could just sit down and write about this stuff. That's really easy to do. When in fact, it's not that easy to write about science. And then on the flip side, journalists or writers saying, oh yeah, I mean, if I had my druthers, I could do this kind of experimentation. I could sit, I just don't have the funding from the labs, or I don't have the support from a university. And it's like, no, that's also not easy.
Yeah.
These are specialized skills. And just because you can do one doesn't automatically mean you can do the other.
And scientists, I think, have this weird kind of duality in that on the one hand, they do have this, oh, yes, I would just knock this out if it was science communication, that'd be fine. I actually have a story about that I will try to remind me to come back to, because I have a story
Yes,
about
please.
that I really like. But so they have the idea, but at the same time, a lot of scientists don't think of themselves as writers, even though honestly they really could, because of how much writing we have to do as scientists. And so when they find writing really, really hard, they're embarrassed and they think, oh my God, this is like my own personal weird neurosis that no one has ever had before.
I know.
And so, it's like at the same time, I actually, this is apropos because I have a piece coming out in, on LitHub, which I feel very self, promotional about, just this one, because LitHub, like, I mean, I'd heard of it, but like, I thought, like, I'm not a writer. I'm just like a whatever scientist. But they wanted me to write about whether science writers experience writer's block differently or how they overcome writer's block, which I didn't quite do, but I turned it into a thing about scientists who write. That scientists could basically we could consider ourselves as writers, but we rarely do. And part of the reason we end up with whatever you could call, I mean, writer's block is sort of a weird old fashioned term, but at any rate, why we have trouble writing sometimes is because we forget that writing is thinking. Writing is not just like sort of being the muse that transduces or, transliterates from your brain to the keyboard.
Yeah, it's not a passive. It's not like like filling out a spreadsheet.
Right. Exactly. And so it's not like, they feel like, oh, why am I having trouble with this? Because, like I should just be able to like let it flow and, blah, blah, blah. And then they come up with all these weird superstitions about what's going to help them write and so on and so forth. Or they say things, I actually talked to someone who also is annoyed by this. They say things like, oh, I'm all done with this whole, study. All I need to do now is write up the results. Like that's sort of a trivial part of it. And
do you remember your dissertation?
Well, but they mean that about their dissertation. They do this before that they feel like it should be easier because they don't understand or they haven't come to grips with the fact that they're writers. All writers find writing hard. There has probably been more written about how neurotic all writers are about writing than any other topic that all writers have thought, deeply about, because all writers are neurotic about writing or at least are certainly struggle with writing. I shouldn't say are neurotic. They struggle with writing because we all do. And I think the more that scientists can realize that as scientists, even if they never write anything for the public, they're still writers.
Absolutely. I mean, it's core to the job. You have to disseminate your ideas, and they have to be privy or they have to be on the exposed for peer review. Otherwise, you're not actually really doing science. You're doing some weird solitary thing that that's not contributing to the body of knowledge that we have. And that makes me curious about your process then, because I as a public, I don't even know what my title is anymore, public science communicator, newly licensed psychologist, and
newly licensed psychologist. Cool.
Yeah, as of last year. Yeah, I went back to school in my mid 30s, and so and a psych PhD is it's a slog. It's like 6 years of your PhD plus a postdoc plus the licensure process. So, but anyway, now I'm
because they let you loose on people. Like with me, the worst that could happen is I just can't find any crickets or something. They let you loose on people. I mean,
it's true. Yeah, they have to keep tabs on if we're doing good work or if we're harming people. But it's true. Yes. So as somebody who's now working in a cancer center and seeing patients regularly, but also still podcasts and engages, I have co-edited some public books. I've I guess technically co-written a public. I have never written a full-length book by myself. It's something I've always wanted to do. It's something that, as you mentioned before, scares the crap out of me. I really struggle with the process of writing. I hate doing it. I love to have done it, but I hate doing it. And I am curious if you have that same experience, or if you're somebody who you can get into a flow state relatively readily, and you have these ideas and kind of feel like, oh, put a page in front of me. I need to get this out on paper.
Huh. of course, having just kind of semi-dissed journalists, I actually was told by someone many years ago that I have a very journalistic approach to writing in that, when I'm trying to make myself we all have to try to make ourselves do stuff, right? You
Right.
don't just think the most fun thing I can possibly do today is, I don't know, maybe there are some people who think that, but, you don't think, oh, the most fun thing I could do today is, write a chapter in my book. I mean, that's just, I don't know, not how the brain works, I don't think.
Screw those people. Yeah,
well,
that's
yeah,
not fair. Yeah. No, I think that's quite uncommon. I think it does exist, but I think it's quite uncommon.
Yes. But anyway, the point being that, she said that the way I write, like my process does tend to be somewhat more journalistic. And I've learned that that's effective. I teach science writing to graduate students, in our program. So, and I've done that several times. And so I'm getting better at it. And there's actually some really good tools for doing it. There's a great book called The Scientist's Guide to Writing by a guy who I know named Stephen Hurd. And everybody who's listening should go get the book, who's a scientist, because it's awesome. But anyway, he, talking about process is always interesting. And I do things like, so for instance, when you're writing, so are you a time person or a words person? Like, do you try to write to a certain time, or do you try and write, and this is true for all writers, like I often ask this, or do you try and write a certain number of words, a day or whatever?
Definitely don't try to write a certain number of words. And as to time, I think it's like I try to maintain focus for as long as I can, and then when I feel it waning, I'm done writing. So I don't even set a clock to it. It's like I say, today I'm going to try and do this, and I'm going to do it until I don't want to do it anymore. That's why I have not written a book. Clearly, the discipline is not developed quite yet.
Well, I will tell, for what it's worth, I will tell you that either having a time or a word limit is helpful to people. And I often have my students try a week of one, try a week of the other. I am a word limit person. I think it's really great to say, okay, I'm going to write X number of words today. And here's why. First of all, it means that you have to push through whether or not you're feeling it. That you just have to get it down, and it's just the number of words. You don't go, you don't need to go back. You don't need to do anything. You really just need to get out the words. And often I find that, it's certainly true that sometimes I feel like, oh, it's just really coming really easily, and I love this, and this is going really well. And then sometimes it's just like, oh my God, really, it's only, 406 now. Now it's 407. Like, am I ever going to get to, whatever my goal is? And then I go back later and read them, and I can't tell the difference. And so that's really
fascinating.
That's a really good lesson in, because I think some of it's just getting over yourself, like just stop thinking this is such a deal.
That's 100% it. Like, I struggle with being like a 1 and 2 draft writer when I know all the best writers are like 5, 8, 10 draft writers. Like, I try to really manipulate the language and make it flow and make it, not perfect, but like how I want it as I'm writing it, which means I waste a lot of time. I just sit and struggle with getting it out when I should just put the concepts on paper and then, improve the language later. But that's always been my struggle. And it's something I have to get past.
But see, having the word limit to me helps with that, because then you know that you're doing what you were supposed to be doing, which is getting a certain number of words. That's all you were supposed to be doing, is just getting the words down, just getting the words. And then you do, of course, go back and revise it later. It's not like, you're not committing to anything, but you get it down, and it gives you something to revise. And so I find that better. Plus, the other thing I like about the word limit is that if I do get distracted or go do something else, or, come back to it, or so, it doesn't matter, because I don't feel guilty for having gone down some internet rabbit hole, because the word number is still waiting for me. Doesn't matter.
Yeah, that's true.
It can take me, however long to write my limit. It can take anywhere from, well, if I actually didn't do this so much for the Outsider Animals book, but for most of my other books, I would try, when I was really writing, and also I should point out, I did not write these books while I gave up my day job. I mean, I was still doing everything else. And I would try and do 1,000 words a day.
Wow.
which is
Wow.
it's a very typical number. It's a very, I discovered this kind of inadvertently, actually from the person who said that I wrote like a journalist, because she said, "Oh yeah, that's very common for us." I was like, really? I had no idea. I thought I just came up with it myself. Apparently not. Or well, I did, but it converged. Anyway, and so, so it removes the guilt from like, oh no, I'm being distracted. Oh no, I'm not concentrating,
Yeah.
because it doesn't
Oof,
matter.
yeah.
Just come back to it and do it later.
Lot of negative self-talk to get over. It makes me wonder too, then, was for outsider animals, for example, was it sort of a disciplined thing? You submitted a proposal, it got accepted, you got your advance, you were expected to write, the draft in X amount of time, you turned it in on time, or was this more of a labor of love that was sort of happening in the background and ebbed and flowed?
I've been doing this long enough that I do, it is more sort of professional, for lack of a better
Mm-hmm.
word.
Yeah.
One of the things I always have to tell my colleagues who are like, "Oh, I want to write a book. In fact, I've already written a book," is to have to break the news to them. If they're scientists and they've written a nonfiction book,
Mm-hmm.
is that's not how this works.
Yeah, and that's
Um,
probably not going to be the book you get published, at least not in
well,
its
you're
current
not going to,
form. Yeah.
and you don't, and the thing is, publishers don't want to see the whole book. If it's not totally
Mm-hmm.
different, if you're writing fiction or poetry, very, very different process. But for writing a scientific book, if it's a very academic scientific book, then sure, you might have written, sort of the manuscript of it, and you'll work with a university press, and
Mm-hmm.
that takes a somewhat different path. But talking about writing for the public, it's actually a pretty straightforward process. Yes, you're right. You have to have a proposal. If you want to work with a university press, you can do it on your own. If you want to work with a commercial press, you have to have an agent. Getting an
Mm-hmm.
agent is not that hard. Well, I don't know. I mean, different people have different experiences, but
Yeah.
I mean, there's a process to this. And again, I do feel like people don't recognize that there is a process to this, and it works in a certain way. And there's the proposal, and editors are super helpful, and your agent is super helpful, and it's really.
Yeah, I think this is a struggle of scientists, and I don't want to throw everybody in the same bucket. There are obviously like outliers, and there are all sorts of different personality styles. But having a foot, because I was a TV presenter before I got into podcasting, so having a foot in sort of like the Hollywood approach,
Oh
in
God.
the world of publishing, in the world of radio, in the world of SAG-AFTRA, and all the Television Academy, all these different things, and then coming from academia first and then coming back to academia later. What I have learned is that there is a type of scientist who thinks that because they are good at science, they are good at everything
Oh
else,
God.
and who loves to reinvent the wheel, who
Yeah.
loves to be like, how would I approach? And it's like, it doesn't matter. There's a whole industry. There's
Yeah,
a way
yes,
to do
yes,
it.
yes,
Like,
yes. All right. So now I want to tell you the story that I mentioned before, which actually
yes, please.
the person who told me that I was a journalist. So she is she's American. She lived in Australia for many, many years, which is where I got to know her. I was on sabbatical,
Mhm.
and she did a lot. Her name is Susan Mousehart, and she's a great writer, and for a while had a column in the biggest newspaper in Australia. She writes about lots of different things. I mean, she's not a science writer. She writes, she wrote books. She had a radio show, that was really popular. She was like really successful, and a wonderful journalist and a wonderful writer. And she said that she was seated next to someone at a dinner party who was an airline pilot. And he asked her and of course it was he, asked her what she did. And she said, oh, I'm a writer, and, I, write books, and, I have a column. And he said, oh, that's so interesting, because, when I retire, I think that's what I'm going to do, is I'm going to, like write for newspapers and publish books. And she, without skipping a beat, said, oh, that is interesting, because when I retire, I'm going to fly 747s.
I love that.
I love this because I love it because it is just so true that people think, oh, right, you could just walk into the cockpit. No, they don't think that. They do not think that you could walk into the cockpit, sit down, and fly the plane. Why do they think that you could just walk into whatever the cockpit equivalent is for being a writer? and just knock out a book that then, that is, or a column that gets into the biggest newspaper in Australia. Like, how
Yeah,
patronizing is that?
exactly. And it's like, it's so many layers, yes,
Yes.
there's that layer of misogyny, but there's
Yes.
also this layer of, because I see it too with my field. Like, people are like, oh yeah, my hairdresser's like my therapist. And I'm like, no, your hairdresser's not like your therapist. Like, your hairdresser's like your friend who you talk to, maybe.
Yes.
But and you see these whole industries, right? Of course, anybody can write anything and self-publish. And so there's
Yes.
this, this whole sea of things. And there's, life coaches and health gurus and all these pseudoscientific approaches that are not evidence-based, that,
Yeah.
are not held to a licensing standard. And it is really insulting. And I think a lot of it comes down to the fact that both in writing and in psychology, at least, the core of it comes down to a honing, I guess you could say, of a very human endeavor. And
Yeah.
science to some extent too, because we are, yes, all scientists at our
That's
core.
right.
We are all curious about the world, and we're
That's
always
right. And we all answer questions about how
Yes.
things work, at least to
Yes.
ourselves. And yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And I suppose less so the airplane thing. So
right. But at the same time,
pilots.
yes, we are not innately pilot. But there is also that whole like hilarious misogynistic thing where, like, when they survey a bunch of men and they're like, do you think you could beat Serena Williams in a tennis match, or do you think you could successfully land a 747? Like, more than half of them say yes. Okay.
Sure, like, I could do that. Yeah. Anyway, but I think the writing thing really, for me, I always tell that story when I'm teaching, and I feel like it's reassuring to people that, no, of course this stuff is hard. Why would you think you could walk into your lab and like know how the PCR machine worked? I mean, why do you think you can immediately write a scientific paper? It's okay. I know it's hard.
Yeah, absolutely. And so, speaking of that difficulty, I am curious, is Outsider Animals, maybe compared to some of your other books, is it something that really, how do I word this? Does this represent the core and the sort of through line through your research foci and like the things that you've been interested throughout your career? Or do you have other books that are more kind of the opus of your work, and this is just an interesting topic that you wanted to dig deeper into? Or obviously there's no binary there.
Well, yeah, no, but I understand what you're saying. I feel sometimes like all of my books are basically about genes, behavior, evolution, and animals. And that's a pretty broad thing, but all of them look at different ways of seeing how people look at animals, how we interpret animal behavior, how we think evolution affects our lives. I mean, that's what the paleo fantasy book was about. That's the book that's done the best, certainly. And so that if obviously people are not going to necessarily know, it's my way of trying to understand how people think evolution influences people and influences our lives and influences what we do. It came out somewhat inadvertently, I mean, not entirely inadvertently, but somewhat inadvertently, around the time that the paleo diet was really peaking. And I knew about that stuff, and I was interested in it, but the book is not about the paleo diet at all. And I mean, I do mention it in there, but of course that immediately, and I'm sure that the fact that people thought it was probably helped the book sell, but I'm primarily interested in how people think evolution affects their lives. Like, how do they talk about human evolution and its impact on our diet? Our diet, but also on the way we raise kids, or on how similar we are to our ancestors in our behavior, or things like that. And similarly, I'm interested in how people look at animals. My very first book was about this, that how people look at animals and come up with ideas about human sex and gender stuff, and that they also think about human sex and gender stuff and then look at animals and go, oh yes, the elephant seals are just like people, or whatever.
Right.
And so I'm interested in that back and forth. And so to some degree, all of my books have been, I like to think they're all different. I mean, they are all different. But they're also all centering on those kinds of topics. uh, the Outsider Animals was fun to write in part because it it was easy. So the chapter structure was easy because each chapter is an animal. So there's that.
Mm-hmm,
I didn't
mm-hmm.
have to do a lot of that external sort of scaffolding. Although certainly within the chapters you have to structure them. But and I've just always been interested in sort of which animals do people like, which animals do people vilify, and why, and what does that mean, and what effect does that have on the world, and yeah.
Yeah, and I love that, I love that you start with raccoons. I love that raccoons are on the cover of the book. I have a very soft spot in my heart for raccoons. I've
Well,
also learned
tell
through
me
the
your raccoon
years.
story. Everybody's got a raccoon story.
I don't even know if I have a specific story. They're just everywhere, and every time I see one, I like squeal with joy. And I
Yeah,
think that
yeah.
I have this may not be a popular opinion, but I do not understand why they are not domesticates yet. I do not
Oh
understand
God.
why they are just it is no different to me why we chose cats and dogs over why we would have chosen raccoons. I get that it's not okay to keep a wild animal as a pet, but I don't understand why historically they did not become domesticated, because they do have so many of those traits and features. Maybe they smell weird or something. I've never been that up close to one. But I will say too that all of my friends from overseas who come to the US for the first time freak out when they see a raccoon. It's like their
Really?
favorite thing in the world.
Oh,
Yeah, I guess because are they only in the Americas?
yeah, yeah. I mean, they've been
Yeah.
introduced to other places, actually,
Hmm.
to the detriment of some of the native wildlife sometimes.
Yeah.
But like they've been awful in
Yeah.
Japan, apparently. Um,
Wow.
but
But yeah, whenever, because they're like, it's like a really exciting, it's kind of like going to Africa and going on safari, and you're so lucky if you see a leopard, right? Because leopards don't want to be out in the broad daylight and blah, blah, blah. But like raccoons are just everywhere. So it's funny when somebody's like, oh my God, a raccoon. I'm like, yeah, dude. Like there's always a raccoon.
I am so going to use. May I use that line that in one of my interviews, someone said that seeing a raccoon was like seeing a leopard if you were on safari.
Yeah.
I love that. I just love that so much. I'm absolutely going to use that in my book talks. I think that's
Amazing.
awesome.
Oh.
But two things about the domestication of raccoons. So one of them is,
Mhm.
if you remember from the book, that there was a big push at the beginning of the 20th century to use raccoons as our model animal for psychology, like instead of
Mhm.
rats
But they're
or
too
pigeons.
smart, right?
Um, there were two different people that wanted to do it, and they were
Uh-huh.
really pushing for it. There are some things that would make it logical. I mean, if people are really interested, they can read about it in the book. It failed, obviously. But what I really like doing is having one of those little alternative history imaginings where I think,
Yes.
if we had done this, first of all, like, how big would our university science labs have to be? Because
Right.
like you'd have to design cages, and you'd like really have to design them because they're really good at opening things. So
Mhm.
you'd have like this supermax, prison kind of design with all these raccoons. And then, and then feeding them, and like all the water and oh my God, what were they thinking? But like,
Yeah.
for a moment it does grip, right? You think, oh yeah, we would all do all of our things with raccoons. I also like it because it underscores that to some extent the use of rats or pigeons or Drosophila, fruit flies, it's all
Yeah.
arbitrary, of course. We pick it for certain reasons, and then the more we use it, the more we make it work, and then the more we make it work, the more we use it. And so,
Absolutely. Yeah. And then and it's the same thing with like, animals as food. Like when you kind of look over human
yeah.
history and look at where we are today, it's not because there's some innate reason that eating a cow versus eating a horse versus eating a dog. Like it's like all of that
Well,
moralistic
that's
stuff.
not entirely true. I mean, if you look at the history, again, this is there are people who are experts in this, and they understand,
Mm.
and our
Mhm.
ancestors, going a long way back, I'm sure there was trial and error in figuring out which animals really worked, and I don't think it was arbitrary.
Yeah,
Because
I guess you're right. You're right.
cows gain weight a lot better. Their reproduction is more well suited. There's lots of reasons why that would all work. There are places where people do say use mare's milk, but it's just not. Having horse dairies is just not. It's just not going to be very functional. So,
Yeah.
so there are reasons. And of course, Jared Diamond's Guns, Germs, and Steel thing was all about like, well, in places where you could domesticate certain animals, that really influenced human civilization. And so, quibble or not with some of the details, I do think that the way that people domesticated animals is based in animals biology, and there are some animals that you can't. So apparently, what is it? That in part, like, so in Africa, there just aren't equivalent animals to like what we could do with, some things here and so forth. So
Yeah, and that's why there's a lot of exported, like there are a lot of donkeys and there are a lot of, but
yeah,
I guess the point,
there
I
is
completely
some
agree.
sense to it. So, but so the use of them as model systems is kind of funny for that. And then the other one is that, remember, if you wanted to, animals that were domesticated really are useful to people. I mean, dogs help people hunt. Cats get rid of vermin. Really, what would raccoons do for us?
Eat all our food.
Yeah. Break into our houses,
trash our houses.
Sofa, it's just, that's just not enough to make it worth going.
That's true.
Like,
they're not pets just as companions.
Right.
They did have sort of a working component to, and I guess also the point that I was poorly trying to make was that there is a large cultural component to the moralistic layer. So yes, it does make sense. Cows are a great food source in a lot of respects, but the reason that we don't eat dogs in America is, and the reason that we sort of like look down on cultures where dogs are eaten has a lot more to do with our like moral values than anything else. Like there are some
absolutely.
sort of arbitrary
and again,
choices there.
And so again, one of the themes of the book is how arbitrary our dismissal of some animals is. That so you're exactly your point, that we decide that, cowbirds are evil because they lay their eggs in other birds' nests, and so we're gonna get all bent out of shape about cowbirds. And it's like, I don't know, people are okay with cuckoos in Europe. I mean, they do like kind of freak out. If you can show somebody a photo of a cuckoo feeding a warbler chick, or sorry, the other way around, a warbler feeding a cuckoo chick, and go, oh my God, that's really bizarre. But they don't hate cuckoos the way that people hate cowbirds. And so I'm really, I'm interested in where that comes from and what it means, and how we view these animals. And a lot of the motivation for this book was, as an animal lover, to just say, look, there's a lot more to these creatures than you think, and they're way more interesting, and there's a lot more depth than the way they're painted.
Yeah, I think a great example of that, or at least one that speaks to me perfectly, they're all great examples in the book, is the chapter that you dedicate to coyotes. I mean, I live in Los Angeles. The coyote is part of our culture here. I live in a very urban part of the city. I live in Eagle Rock, which is on the east side of the city, sort of on its way towards Glendale and Pasadena. And the Angeles Forest is right above us. You can see the mountains, from everywhere in Eagle Rock. And there are coyotes walking around my development, and my development is paved. You know what I mean? Like, we don't have a lot of trees right where I am. And there are just coyotes hanging out with people all the time. And I think that they are amazing. Every time I see a coyote, I'm like, oh, it's a coyote. Oh my God, look how beautiful. Look how interesting. And other people are like, kill it. It's going to get my chihuahua. I hate coyotes. They're such a pest. And it just, it bums me out how different those perspectives can be.
And the coyotes are particularly interesting because they're their own thing. Like the people have been trying to exterminate them for hundreds of years unsuccessily. And Bethany Brookshire, who you may know or know of, do you know who she is?
I do. Yeah.
Oh, good. So she has a newsletter that it was a Substack, whatever. Anyway, and a great book called Pests that I really liked. And she has a great piece called, Kill More Coyote, Get More Coyote, which is kind of the way it's worked, that the more people tried to exterminate coyotes, the more coyotes bred, and they just spread into new areas. And they're a very different animal in that regard than, say, wolves. In part, my understanding is because coyotes are more solitary. They do, they will be in groups, but they don't have to be in groups, and they don't have structured social systems. And so with wolves, if you kill a couple of the key members of the pack can't persist. With coyotes, they'll just adjust and make more coyotes.
Yeah.
And so it's a
Yeah.
very different dynamic than you get with wolves. Plus, again, people are really crap at assessing risk. And
Hmm.
so, not to diminish, like we used to. So I lived in Riverside for many, many years, and we, for a while, had indoor outdoor cats. And then we kept them completely indoors because they would have run-ins with either coyotes or foxes or whatever. And I
Hmm.
thought, this is just stupid. But so I know it's not like coyotes never will do that, but they really don't go after people's pets. They also don't eat people's garbage. If you leave them alone, they will mostly eat rodents. They'll eat rabbits, they'll eat squirrels, they'll other stuff. They'll eat fruit. But they really don't want to go after people's pets. And my favorite thing in that chapter, I read some fabulous stuff about that. That's a good example of something. Like, I'm not a mammologist and I'm not an expert in coyotes, of course, at all. But I read some wonderful stuff and interviewed some great people about this. And one of the facts that really stuck with me about coyotes is that people vastly, vastly, vastly overestimate how big they are. So let me ask you,
Yeah.
if you don't mind. So
Sure.
how much do you think an average adult male coyote weighs?
Oh, let me think about this. Okay, so my dog only weighs 9 pounds. My dog is teeny tiny.
More than that. More
Yeah,
than
and my
that.
guess is that a German Shepherd or like a large Lab or a large Golden weighs like 60 pounds. So I don't know if that's quite right, but that's my guess. So I would think a coyote weighs like 35 pounds.
So dead on about the coyote. That's perfect. I think an adult male's is 39 is
Okay,
average,
yeah.
but that
Yeah,
is
they're really but that's because I'm exposed to them a lot and they're
yes. And so
small.
that's really impressive because
Mm,
almost nobody else gets that. And one of the books that I read said that they had encountered somebody who was freaked out at after seeing a coyote and had been walking his mastiff, and those are big dogs, those are like 100 pounds,
mhm.
and said that the coyote was about the size of his dog. And it
Yeah,
just so
yeah, there's
happened that
no
that
way.
coyote it was collared and it had been weighed like the week before, and it was like 39. And so people just way overestimate this. They think, oh, here's another one, so what breed of dog do you think is most similar to, like the weight of a coyote?
Oh, I always think that coyotes look kind of like Shiba Inus to me, like
Ooh.
those small Japanese like sled dogs. But let's see, maybe something more common that you would see around here. What would it look like in terms of its weight? I think a lot of people are probably going to say things like huskies and stuff. They're not nearly as big as huskies.
That's
So
right. That's right.
yeah, I can't think of a smaller dog that looks like that. Yeah,
So,
Shiba
so
Inu,
it doesn't
gotta
have
go
to
with
look
that.
like that. It just has to weigh the same.
Mm,
And so
hmm.
my colleague Jeff Miller, who's part of the Twin Cities Coyote and Fox Project, which is really cool and which tags and follows and informs about coyotes and foxes all over the Twin Cities greater area. Um,
Hmm.
he says that the best comparison that he always tells people is a beagle.
Oh, yeah, yeah, that would make sense. They're probably right around 30 to 40
Right,
pounds.
yeah.
Yeah, that's
And
funny.
yet he says no one comes up with that. No one ever says they're
Uh-huh.
about the size of a beagle.
Uh-huh.
And so I think people are just, they react to things emotionally. And again, I don't mean to, be like, ha ha, people are stupid. It's not that. It's just that
Right.
we naturally overestimate unlikely events,
We
that we think
do.
are threatening. It's like the thing of, people blithely, it's like the whole driving in a car, getting in an airplane contrast.
Mhm.
That
Yeah.
it's way riskier, driving than it is, flying. Even though, and I say this as someone who hates turbulence and gets nervous on planes. So, like, okay, so I get it. People do that.
I think it's also too there's this component that obviously you touch on so importantly that we are people who are living on a planet who are probably the most invasive species. Like we have done the most terraforming, the most transformation of the landscape. And I think that there is this very anthropocentric perspective where, I'm living in my community and I think that the entire world is sort of, bending to my will. And what is this coyote doing in my space?
Right,
And
right,
like we're
absolutely.
always having to remind ourselves, I'm in its space.
Well, and also that coyotes again are a very interesting case study of this because they have interacted with humans ever since there have been humans in North America. Of
Mm.
course, all the, Native Americans knew about them. Native Americans had lots of stories about them, had lots of interactions with them, thought they were part of the landscape. And then, as humans moved into different parts of North America and after Europeans came, coyotes were like, okay, sure, we can do this too. And
Yeah.
and they are much more like that than animals that have been pushed to the margins or animals that have been altered by agricultural development or something like that. That for coyotes, it's they're so adaptable and they're so able to live in lots of different places. Now, I will point out, in case there's people listening who are like, yes, but I know someone whose dog was eaten by a coyote. Like, I get that. I get
Hmm.
that,
Hmm.
that they're not completely without, any risk. But there's a lot of things in our lives that are that have risks, and we just need to learn to manage them. You can't
Yeah.
create a sterile environment.
Yeah, no, it's so true. And I obviously picked these two examples that are near and dear to my heart, but also they're mammals, they're cute, they look soft and they have cute faces that remind us of our own faces. But I do like that you focused not just on, these outsider animals that we have kind of an ambivalent relationship with, but you did focus on, like you mentioned before, cowbirds and cuckoos and even like cabbage white butterflies, rats, cockroaches, like animals that we think of as sort of maybe less charismatic.
I always tell the cockroach chapter is my favorite chapter. Which, I mean, I am a bug, like I study insects and always have, and so, maybe that's not entirely unexpected, but I had such a good time writing that one. Cockroaches, I mean, they're just amazing. Plus, cockroaches are such cultural icons. It's
Hmm.
it's just so interesting, like trying to delve into all the weird stuff about cockroaches in literature and cockroaches that people used as symbols, and they're very interesting that way.
So have you tell me in your own research and career, have you dedicated most of your work to insects?
Yes, yes. I have
Mm.
worked on birds, and I always tell people I'm not really an entomologist because I didn't go specifically like, okay, I'm going to spend my career studying insects. I'm interested in questions that have to do with the evolution of sex differences. I'm interested in host parasite interactions. I'm interested in a bunch of other things. Uh, I've ended up studying insects because they've turned out to be fabulous for answering those questions. And also, I do really love insects, but
Mhm.
I'm not really an entomologist. And also, I've never had as a goal in my career or anywhere else to try to control insects. I mean, I'm not like, again, dismissing people who do want to control insects. It's just not what I do.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So I'm curious, ultimately when you sat down to write Outsider Animals, what were some of your explicit goals for communicating to the public? Like what were you hoping that people would take away with a better appreciation of?
Well, so to start with, of course, I think, and this is true for most people who start writing books, that I didn't start out with the more abstract part of it and then fill it in with the
Right.
actual, like, oh, and I want to talk about this species to illustrate this point. It was kind of the reverse. I originally started writing the book or no, that's not true. I didn't start writing the book. I originally had the idea for the book many years ago when I was talking to someone, Jim Gorman, who was a writer for the New York Times, and he he wrote about animals a lot, and so he ended up consulting me about several things. And he wrote
Mm-hmm.
this fantastic article about gulls that I just loved, and we started talking about how gulls were an example of these animals that were really fun, but everybody like got dismissed them, and everybody was thought they were pests and was annoyed by them. And he in his article made the point that, well, if you didn't have people doing what people do, you wouldn't have problems with gulls. And we started talking about how we both loved those kinds of animals, and I think that was when we started talking about them as, oh yeah, they're kind of like the animal outsiders. They're kind of outsider animals. And we even talked briefly about like, we should write a book together about these. And that would be awesome because he's a fantastic writer. And then, of course that got dropped and COVID and
Mm-hmm.
I don't know what else happened. And then when I decided I wanted an idea for a book. I wanted to come back to that. I ran it by my agent. She thought it was a good idea. I actually, tried to see if he still was around and writing, but he doesn't seem to be writing for the New York Times anymore. And so I thought, okay, well, I think he'll be okay with it. So I just, went ahead. But that was how it kind of started. And I thought, and then I had fun trying to come up with a list of, which animals do I want to use? And I swapped some back and forth. And one of the things I'm planning on doing, I'm just getting started with promoting the book in talks and whatnot. One of the things I'm planning on doing is asking audiences, okay, so which animals do you think I left out that you think are outsider animals that, you'd like to include? And so, it's like the list was not it was not graven in stone or anything like that. I was going to include bats initially because I really do think bats are kind of an interesting outsider animal. And then both my agent and one of the editors said, nah. And I was like, okay.
Yeah, because now you have to do it, dedicate a huge portion of your book to zoonotic infections and go off in all these directions.
And also, anyway, there were a bunch of reasons. But I think they would be interesting. But anyway, so I don't know. So let me ask you. You could be my first person to ask this. Were there animals that you thought oh, I wish she'd included that one?
I guess for me, one of the animals that I'm often curious about are pigeons.
Oh, yeah. I thought deeply about pigeons, but there are so many books about pigeons.
Yeah. And it's the same thing with bats, right?
There are pigeon people. There's a lot about pigeons.
Yeah, they're pigeon people. They're bat people. And so there are whole books dedicated to those concepts. But it is interesting whenever you hear stories about how cigarette butts are affecting these populations or the ways that they're integrating certain human refuse into nests. And I don't know, there's just we live side by side with so much ecology that is underfoot, overhead, in the tree that we do not even notice. And I think probably one of the best ways to have a better appreciation, I've talked to people about this on the show before, is do something with regards to
Oh,
native gardening. I live in a house that has no grass. I live in a small lot home. Yeah. So it's like a 3-story with a roof deck. There's when you actually look at the title of my house, the square footage of my house is bigger than the lot it sits on because of the way that, this new way of living in very crowded cities. That said, I can still have, a hummingbird feeder on my roof. I can still, have potted plants, but try and make sure that those potted plants are California native potted plants that will attract California native wildlife, or even LA local native. And there are all sorts of resources to be able to do that. So I am definitely always curious about what is here in spite of us. So what would be here if we actively welcomed it? You know what I mean?
And I think, and again, getting back to the insects, this is why insects are such a great introduction to the natural world. So I grew up in Los Angeles. I'm from LA, and and sort of LA, not like a suburb or a valley or anything. And insects were my introduction to the natural world. There were not coyotes in my yard, and so I mean, actually, maybe there were, and I just never saw them. But I'm pretty sure there were not. But there were caterpillars, and I could take a caterpillar and put it in a jar and feed it whatever it had been on and make and watch it make a butterfly. And that was my introduction to the natural world. And I think it can work really well for people as long as that, and luckily my parents were kind of indifferent, which I think is probably the best thing. They neither encouraged nor discouraged me. It was just, whatever, as long as you do well in school, we don't care about the caterpillars. And so I think that was a really great way to think about nature as a child and do it kind of informally and not make a big deal of it, but just realize, oh, look, there's all this cool stuff. I will say, though, that I was bitterly disappointed because I had the How and Why Wonder Book of Insects when I was a kid, and which is, let me point out to those people, which is probably most people who are not familiar with the How and Why Wonder Book series, that they're very slim, they're kind of, 8.5 by 11, but, paperback, but with a lot of illustrations, and they're probably half an inch thick. They're really for kids. But there were pictures of insects in it, and there were fritillaries, butterflies, that I looked at them, and I was raising fritillaries in the backyard. And I looked at the fritillary in the book, and it was different than the fritillary that I had. And so I thought, oh my God, I have a fritillary that is new to science. I was sure that I had discovered, a new species of fritillary. And of course, realized that much later that there were many species of fritillaries, and they were just depicting
and they were just picking one. Yeah.
Which was a little bit crushing, but anyway. So yeah, I think bugs are a great way to do this. And people always think, oh, kids are interested in bugs. Well, why can't grown-ups be interested in bugs? I think it's great when grown-ups are interested in bugs.
I completely agree. And it's so funny. I just Googled because I had completely forgotten. But early on in my career as a science journalist, long before I went back to school, one of the things that I was most proud of in terms of, not, most proud of doing, but in terms of like when they blow smoke and you win awards and things like that, which do not tie to the things you're most proud of. But I got an LA Area Emmy Award way back in 2015. I can't believe that was 11 years ago for a segment I did for PBS. It was KCET at the time on a show called SoCal Connected. I won the feature segment category for a piece called Natural History Museum Citizen Science Insect Labeling Project, where I went to the homes of Angelinos who had insect traps in their backyards that the Natural History Museum put in. And there was a little boy who discovered a new species, and they got to name it after him. Aww. And it was just such a cool thing that here in the middle of the city, we were learning things about all of the incredible bugs all around us. And yes, his parents were also just as interested, and they are grown-ups. And and of course, all the scientists at the museum that I interviewed were like huge nerds about their work. And it was so fun to see how excited and interested they were too. We can always be learning.
What a great story. And
right?
Now I want to look it up. I bet it was a great story. No, and again, I think that it also, insects are also great for illustrating. We just know so little about the natural world. Like virtually any group you want to pick is, within insects, there's going to be new species discovered because we just haven't been paying attention.
Yeah. And just their basic kind of, I don't know if adaptability is the right word, because it's not that insects are inherently more, but, they have shorter life cycles, blah, blah, blah. There are so many insects that are really coexisting with us in a way that I don't think we often take the time to fully appreciate. And that's what for me is the big takeaway from your book, that these animals that we think of as sort of, over there or right over there, maybe in the way, maybe sort of obnoxious or annoying or pests, are these marvels of evolution and these incredible organisms that in a lot of ways are sort of, I don't know, it takes me back to when I used to teach biology and I would teach lab and I would give this talk to the kids at the beginning of our fetal pig dissection unit, and I would be like putting the fear of God in them, like, these animals died so we can learn from them. Like, you will respect this animal, and I don't want to hear anything about somebody piercing its ears or and I just think that there is this respect and this kind of deep humility that I maybe sometimes don't always tap into, but strive to tap into for these organisms that have adapted to us very thanklessly, to be honest, and continue to contribute to ecologic diversity, contribute to our surroundings in a really fundamental way. And yet we don't often give them the time of day to learn about them and appreciate them.
Oh, thanks so much. That's actually one of the best, summaries of the book that, that I could have hoped for. I really, I'm having like a little emotional, you get me kind of moment.
Oh, yay. I'm so glad to hear it. Gosh. Well, I feel like what a better kind of high note to end our incredible conversation on. I cannot thank you enough. This was such a fascinating and really fun journey, both into sort of the process of science writing, the perspective of a scientist who does science writing, but also a lot of these really interesting stories. And of course, there's so much more in the book, you guys, as you know, listening to Talk Nerdy. I don't like to give away too much of the book. I like to whet people's appetite about it so that they can pick it up and dig deeper. So everybody, the book is Outsider Animals: How the Creatures at the Margins of Our Lives Have the Most to Teach Us by Dr. Marlene Zuk. Marlene, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you. This has been a real pleasure.
Absolutely. And everybody listening, thank you for coming back week after week. I'm really looking forward to the next time we all get together to talk nerdy.